I still hear that sound when everything is quiet. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs locking around my father's wrists, while he stood on the old wooden dock his own grandfather built by hand. He was 78 years old. White hair, weathered hands, his fishing hat still sitting crooked on his head. His crime? Walking along the shoreline of the private lake our family had owned and protected for generations. Across the water, a small crowd of HOA residents stood frozen, watching as two private security guards treated him like a trespasser. And right behind them, smiling like she was posing for a victory photo, stood the HOA president, Lauren Whitmore. Clipboard tucked under her arm, voice calm and rehearsed, she announced, "This lake is now a shared community asset." That was the exact moment something inside me snapped. This wasn't confusion. It wasn't a paperwork mistake. It wasn't about rules, neighbors, or compromise. This was a land grab, plain and simple. Less than a month earlier, I had inherited 2,300 acres of family land. Somehow, almost overnight, an HOA decided my bloodline no longer belonged on it. By the next morning, every faucet in that neighborhood ran dry. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Gone Wild, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? The land sits just outside Cedar Hollow County, Virginia, where the hills roll softly and the mornings smell like wet stone and pine needles. My grandfather, Walter Hayes, bought the first parcel back when the county barely had paved roads. He was an engineer by trade and stubborn by nature, the kind of man who believed land wasn't just owned, it was stewarded. Over decades, he added to it piece by piece until the property stretched farther than most people could see from a single hilltop. At its heart was the lake, spring-fed, cold, clear, and deliberate. He designed it himself, carving stone channels by hand and redirecting underground flow so the lake would never run dry, even in the worst summers. That lake was never an accident. It was a system. My father, Thomas Hayes, grew up on that water. He learned to swim there, taught me how to cast a line there, and spent most of his retirement mornings sitting on the dock before sunrise with a thermos of coffee. He believed deeply in being a good neighbor. If a kid wandered down with a fishing pole, my dad handed him worms. If a family wanted to picnic near the shore, he waved them in. There were no fences, no signs, no gates, just trust. The lake was private, but my father treated it like a gift, something to be shared as long as people respected it. For a long time, that trust was never tested. Then Silver Pines Estates appeared uphill like it had been dropped from the sky. Bulldozers, survey flags, and glossy signs promising luxury living surrounded by nature. Houses went up fast. Big ones, clean lines, manicured lawns, identical mailboxes. At first, the developers were friendly. They sent letters introducing themselves, talked about community values, and thanked my father for being so welcoming when their first residents wandered down to the water. What I didn't see at the time, what none of us noticed, was how quickly the language changed. Their brochures featured photos of our lake, wide shots taken at sunset, kids splashing near the shore, a couple sitting on the dock where my father drank his coffee every morning. Under the photos, captions read things like exclusive neighborhood amenities and natural recreational access. There were no contracts, no easements, no written permissions, just assumptions printed in glossy ink and sold to homeowners who believed every word of it. At first, it stayed polite. Residents asked before coming down. They waved. They thanked my dad. Then the questions stopped. Cars parked closer. Parties lasted longer. Trash appeared along the shoreline. When my father gently asked a group to clean up after themselves one evening, someone laughed and said, "Relax, we all live here." That was the first time I heard unease in his voice. Things shifted fast after Lauren Whitmore became HOA president. She hadn't lived there long, but she carried herself like someone who'd already decided how the story would end. The first letter arrived thick and formal, filled with legal phrasing about shared resources and maintenance obligations. She requested a meeting to discuss fair use arrangements. My father agreed, assuming this was a misunderstanding that could be handled with a handshake and a pot of coffee. He came home from that meeting quieter than usual. Lauren didn't ask. She demanded impact fees, monthly access charges, liability transfers, language that treated our lake not as private property, but as an underutilized asset she felt entitled to manage. When my father tried explaining the history, the engineering, the fact that the lake existed long before Silver Pines, she smiled politely and said things like, "That may have been true once, and communities evolve." To her, goodwill looked like weakness. The letters kept coming, each one firmer than the last. Deadlines, consequences, warnings about compliance. When my father didn't respond quickly enough, inspectors started appearing near the property line. Anonymous complaints were filed about unsafe docks and unauthorized structures, despite the dock having stood there longer than the HOA itself. I tried stepping in, but Lauren brushed me off with the same calm confidence, speaking to me like I was a minor inconvenience instead of the legal owner of the land. She talked about precedent, about community expectations, about how difficult things could become if we kept resisting progress. My father still believed reason would prevail. He believed that if he stayed calm and respectful, the situation would cool down. Instead, it escalated. Every act of patience seemed to invite another push. Every attempt at cooperation was met with another demand. That was when I realized something important had already happened. Without a single vote, without a signed document, without our consent, Silver Pines had rewritten the story in their own minds. The lake wasn't ours anymore. It was theirs, and they were just waiting for us to get tired enough to stop arguing. The tension didn't explode all at once. It crept in quietly, like water seeping through cracks in stone. And by the time we felt the pressure building, it was already clear that someone was preparing to force the issue. After that first round of letters, everything changed. The pressure didn't come all at once. It arrived in pieces, dressed up as policy and procedure, each one small enough to explain away if you didn't look too closely. A violation notice taped to a post near the shoreline, claiming the dock lacked updated safety markings. A complaint filed about unauthorized foot traffic on land that had been ours since before the county had a zoning office. A survey crew showing up unannounced, staking flags along our tree line as if the boundaries were suddenly up for debate. Lauren called it enforcement. I called it harassment with better stationery. Every week there was something new. A warning about liability exposure, a demand for documentation that had never been required before, threats of fines for non-compliance if we didn't respond within unreasonable timelines. When we did respond, the goalposts moved. When we asked for clarification, we got silence. When we tried to set meetings, they were postponed or canceled at the last minute. What hurt the most wasn't the paperwork. It was watching what it did to my father. Thomas Hayes had always been steady, the kind of man who woke up before dawn, drank his coffee on the dock, and waved to anyone who passed by. Now he was up at all hours, rereading letters at the kitchen table, trying to understand legal language that was clearly written to intimidate rather than inform. His sleep became restless. His hands shook when he poured coffee. His doctor adjusted his blood pressure medication twice in a single month. Lauren framed it differently, of course. In HOA meetings and email blasts, she described him as resistant, uncooperative, and eventually an obstacle to progress. She talked about modernization and fairness, about how one family shouldn't control access to a resource so many people enjoyed. The way she said it, you'd think my father was hoarding something that belonged to everyone else. I tried to step in more forcefully. I requested formal mediation. I sent certified letters asserting ownership and denying any implied access rights. I asked for proof of their claims, documentation of easements, anything concrete. The responses were cold and carefully vague. Phrases like ongoing review and pending enforcement actions showed up again and again. It was like arguing with fog. The more reasonable I tried to be, the more emboldened Lauren became. The breaking point came on a Saturday afternoon under a clear sky, when the HOA scheduled what they called a community access briefing down by the lake. They framed it as an informational gathering, a chance to explain new policies. Residents showed up with folding chairs and phones out, curious and excited. My father didn't want to go. He said it felt wrong. I convinced him to come anyway, believing that public settings discourage bad behavior. I was wrong. Lauren stood near the dock with a portable microphone, smiling like she was hosting a ribbon cutting. She talked about shared values, about safety, about how the HOA had a responsibility to protect residents from unregulated private control. Then her tone shifted. She announced that effective immediately, access to the lake would be restricted pending compliance reviews. Before anyone could ask what that meant, 2 uniformed private security guards stepped forward. They didn't look at me. They didn't look at the crowd. They walked straight toward my father, who was standing quietly on the dock, hands resting on the railing. One of them told him he needed to step away from the water. My father laughed at first, thinking it was a misunderstanding. He explained calmly that this was his land, his dock, his lake. Lauren didn't correct them. Instead, she nodded. The guards told him again, this time firmer. When he didn't move fast enough, they took his arms. I heard someone in the crowd gasp. I heard my father say, "There's no need for this." And then I heard the sound that still echoes in my head, metal closing around bone. They escorted him off the dock like he was trespassing on his own past. Lauren thanked everyone for their cooperation and reminded the crowd that enforcement was necessary for the good of the community. Phones were recording. Neighbors whispered. No one stepped in. No one stopped it. My father stood there, humiliated, confused, his dignity stripped away in front of people he had welcomed for years. I wanted to shout. I wanted to tear the clipboard out of her hands. Instead, I helped my father into the truck and drove him home in silence. That night, as he sat staring at the dark window instead of the lake he loved, something settled in my chest, a cold understanding. Lauren hadn't crossed a line by accident. She had crossed it on purpose. She wasn't enforcing rules. She was daring us to fight back. After that day on the dock, I stopped trying to explain myself to people who had already decided I was the enemy. Arguing with Lauren had gotten us nowhere. Letters, emails, meetings, all of it had been noise. So I did the one thing she hadn't expected. I went quiet. Instead of reacting, I started digging. My grandfather never threw anything away. In the old barn behind the house, there were shelves stacked with rolled maps, yellowed notebooks, and metal filing drawers so heavy they took 2 hands to open. I spent nights down there with a single light bulb overhead, brushing dust off documents that hadn't been touched in decades. Hand-drawn plats, survey markers, old easements recorded before Silver Pines was even an idea. And then there were the engineering notes. That was when the lake stopped looking like a pretty body of water and started looking like what it really was. The lake wasn't just a hole filled with rain. It was the visible heart of a system. My grandfather had mapped underground springs that crossed multiple properties, carefully redirecting flow through stone-lined channels and pressure points so the water would stay clean, cold, and reliable. He designed it to feed the valley below in a controlled way, protecting farmland during dry seasons. The lake was the reservoir, the source, and Silver Pines sat directly downstream. Once I saw that, everything clicked. Their sudden urgency, their obsession with community access, their fixation on control. They weren't just chasing recreation. They were positioning themselves upstream of leverage they didn't fully understand. I kept digging. Late one night, While sorting through an old tool chest my grandfather used for stonework, I noticed something odd. The bottom drawer was heavier than it should have been. When I pulled it out, I found a false panel. Behind it was a thick, sealed envelope wrapped in oilcloth to keep moisture out. Inside were original water rights documents, notarized and recorded long before modern zoning laws. Clear language, clear boundaries, and tucked behind those papers was a handwritten letter in my grandfather's careful script. He explained the system, the reasoning behind it, and why he built a manual flow control valve hidden beneath the hillside near the lake. Not to punish anyone, but as a safeguard. A way to protect the source if someone ever tried to misuse it. I sat there for a long time holding those papers, my hands shaking. For the first time since Lauren humiliated my father, the balance shifted. Not in her favor, in ours. But that realization came with a weight I hadn't expected. Because when you control water, you don't just control power, you control lives. Families lived in Silver Pines. Kids brushed their teeth there. People cooked, bathed, and depended on that flow without ever knowing where it came from. I thought about my father teaching neighborhood kids how to fish, about the trust he believed in, about the way Lauren had twisted that trust into a weapon. I could turn the valve. Technically, legally, I could. The documents were airtight, but doing it recklessly would make me exactly what she was painting us as. Selfish, vindictive, careless, with others' well-being. That wasn't who we were. So I made a decision right there in the barn, surrounded by dust and history. If I used this leverage, it would be precise, measured. A demonstration, not a punishment. Proof, not revenge. Enough to expose the truth without hurting the innocent people who had been misled by someone drunk on authority. Lauren believed power came from meetings, microphones, and security guards. She believed control was something you announced out loud and enforced in public. My grandfather had believed something different. Real power, he taught me, was built quietly, documented carefully, and used only when there was no other choice. Once Lauren realized I had stopped responding to her letters and stopped showing up to her meetings, she didn't back off. She escalated, harder and louder, like someone who sensed control slipping and decided to tighten their grip before anyone noticed. It started with an announcement blasted through the HOA mailing list and posted on their website under a banner that read, "Future Community Enhancements." Buried beneath the cheerful language were renderings of my family's lake transformed into something unrecognizable. A manicured shoreline, paved paths, a floating dock complex, even early discussions about integrating the water feature into a small private golf course to increase neighborhood value. She referred to the lake as a managed recreational asset, as if it had already changed hands. What really caught my attention was a single line near the bottom. Temporary construction access pending final ownership review. That was when I knew she was no longer bluffing. Within days, Lauren filed what she called an emergency claim, arguing that long-term community use established implied ownership rights. She leaned heavily on vague legal language, hinting at adverse possession without ever saying the words outright. The goal wasn't to win cleanly, it was to overwhelm us, to force us into a defensive posture so expensive and exhausting that giving up would feel like relief. I took the documents to Evan Brooks. Evan didn't look like much at first glance. Soft-spoken, glasses always sliding down his nose. The kind of attorney who preferred case law to courtroom drama. He read every page slowly, marking margins, occasionally shaking his head. When he finished, he leaned back and sighed. "She's not just wrong," he said. "She's reckless." He explained that her claims ignored recorded water rights, misrepresented access history, and relied on assumptions that fell apart the moment they were challenged. Worse, some of the filings crossed into misrepresentation, not aggressive advocacy, Fraud. The kind that only works if no one checks the facts. Lauren assumed I wouldn't. Her final mistake came a week later. One morning, county vehicles pulled onto my driveway. Two officials stepped out, polite but serious. They said they were responding to a report of potential infrastructure sabotage related to a shared water system. The complaint alleged tampering, environmental risk, even hinted at public safety concerns. I didn't need to ask who filed it. Lauren had decided that if she couldn't bully me into compliance, she'd paint me as a threat. She assumed the accusation alone would scare me into backing down, or, at the very least, put me on the defensive while she pushed her plans through. Instead, it did the opposite. I invited the officials inside, showed them the documents, the diagrams, the recorded rights. I explained the system, the engineering, the safeguards my grandfather built. They listened. They asked questions. They took notes. By the time they left, their concern had shifted direction. Because once county officials see real documentation, real infrastructure, and real history, they start asking real questions. Questions Lauren hadn't prepared for. Her false report didn't put a spotlight on me. It put one on her. And for the first time since this started, I wasn't reacting to Lauren's moves. I was setting the stage for her to answer for them. The HOA called the meeting with less than a week's notice, which told me everything I needed to know. Urgency favors people who want to control the room before anyone has time to think. By the time I pulled into the community center parking lot, every space was full. Trucks lined the road. Folding chairs had been dragged out from storage and set up along the walls. People were talking in low, excited voices, the way crowds do when they think they're about to witness something important. Lauren Whitmore arrived like she was stepping onto a stage she'd rehearsed for. She wore a tailored blazer and a confident smile, the kind that suggests the outcome is already decided. Large poster boards were set up behind her with diagrams of the lake, arrows pointing outward, phrases like shared benefit, and future development printed in clean, professional fonts. When she stepped up to the microphone, she was greeted with applause from people who believed they were about to hear good news. I took a seat near the back, quiet, a slim folder resting on my lap. Inside were certified copies of documents most of the room had never seen. I wasn't interested in applause. I was interested in facts. Lauren spoke smoothly. She talked about growth, about responsibility, about how Silver Pines needed a plan for the future. She framed the lake as a resource that had been informally managed for too long, implying neglect without ever saying it outright. Every time she said the word community, people nodded. When she mentioned property values, they leaned forward. Then she unveiled the diagrams, explaining how access points could be expanded, how water features could be integrated into neighborhood amenities. She spoke as if the lake was already hers to redesign, as if ownership were a technicality that would resolve itself once everyone agreed it should. When she finished, she opened the floor for questions. I stood. The room quieted in a way that surprised even me. Lauren's smile tightened just slightly when she recognized me. I introduced myself calmly, stated my ownership of the land, and asked if the county water officer present could confirm the status of historic water rights tied to the lake. That was the first crack. The officer hesitated, then nodded. He explained that he had reviewed documents earlier that week, and that, yes, there were recorded water rights predating the development by decades, rights that designated the lake as a controlled source, not a shared utility. Murmurs spread through the room. Lauren interrupted, insisting that ongoing use changed things, that modern community needs outweighed old records. The officer shook his head. Recorded rights don't expire because someone wishes they would. I opened my folder and handed over copies. The officer verified them on the spot. Dates, notarizations, county stamps, everything Lauren had been speaking around without acknowledging. Then I asked for something no one expected. I asked for a demonstration. The room went silent. I explained, carefully, that the lake fed a downstream system and that there was a manual control point built into the infrastructure decades earlier. I emphasized that this was not a threat, not an act of hostility, but a factual demonstration of where control actually existed. Lauren objected loudly, calling it reckless, irresponsible, dangerous. Her voice rose, sharp and frantic. But the county officer raised a hand and asked one simple question. "Can you restore flow immediately?" "Yes," I said. After a brief discussion, they agreed to observe. I made a call. Just one. Somewhere beneath the hillside, out of sight, the valve was turned. Not shut, just adjusted. It took less than 5 minutes. Phones started buzzing across the room. A man near the front frowned at his screen and whispered to his neighbor. Someone else stood up, saying their sprinklers had just stopped mid-cycle. A woman near the aisle said her kitchen sink had lost pressure. Lauren went pale. Her confidence drained faster than the water ever did. She started talking all at once, contradicting herself, insisting this proved the lake was unsafe, that control should be transferred immediately. But the room wasn't listening anymore. I told them I had no interest in punishing families or disrupting lives, that the water would always flow as long as it was respected, that this was never about power for me. It was about truth. Lauren said nothing. For the first time since this began, she had no words. The message didn't need repeating. Everyone in that room understood it. I controlled the source. And I had chosen restraint. Lauren unraveled fast after that meeting. Authority only works when people believe in it, and once the room understood where the real control sat, her confidence turned brittle. She tried to regain it with emails sent late at night, long explanations full of legal jargon and reassurance that everything was still under HOA management. But the tone had changed. The language sounded defensive now, desperate. Within days, questions started surfacing that she couldn't answer. Residents wanted to know why HOA funds had been spent on private security without a vote, why invoices listed consulting services that no one remembered approving, why there were payments routed through third-party vendors that didn't seem to exist outside of a mailing address and a post office box. People who had trusted her judgment began comparing notes, forwarding emails, asking for records she had never expected anyone to actually read. The county didn't wait long. Once officials had confirmed the water rights and reviewed the false sabotage report Lauren filed against me, they widened the scope. What started as a property dispute quietly became a financial review, then a compliance audit, then something much heavier. County investigators requested HOA banking records, security contracts, communications related to enforcement actions. Lauren was asked to provide explanations under oath. She stalled. She deflected. She blamed former board members. But paper doesn't forget, and neither do digital records. It came out that the security guards who handcuffed my father were never properly authorized. The contract had been rushed through without a board vote, paid for with reserve funds earmarked for road repairs. Several invoices were altered after the fact, dates changed, descriptions rewritten to justify expenses that had already been made. Emails surfaced where Lauren discussed creating pressure and making an example to force compliance. The false report against me didn't help her case either. County officials don't take kindly to being used as leverage in personal power struggles. What she had framed as concern for public safety was documented as knowingly misleading. That single decision flipped the narrative completely. The county issued a temporary freeze on HOA authority pending a full investigation. Enforcement actions were suspended. Funds were locked. The board was instructed to stand down. For the first time since Silver Pines was built, the HOA had no teeth. Lauren called an emergency meeting. It was nothing like the one by the lake. No applause, no smiles. Just folding chairs filled with residents who looked tired, angry, and confused. She stood at the front of the room, pale and rigid, reading from prepared notes with a voice that cracked despite her best effort to keep it steady. She announced her resignation, in the interest of the community, framing it as a noble sacrifice. No one clapped. Someone asked about the missing funds. Another resident demanded to know why their dues had paid for private guards instead of street maintenance. A third asked, quietly but firmly, why an elderly man had been treated like a criminal on his own land. Lauren didn't answer. She stepped away from the podium and left the room through a side door. But resignation doesn't erase records. It doesn't undo false filings. And it doesn't stop an investigation once it's already moving. Charges followed. Fraud related to misrepresentation of HOA funds, filing false reports, unauthorized enforcement actions, each one grounded in documentation she assumed no one would ever connect. The calm, polished authority she had worn like armor disappeared, replaced by silence and legal counsel. The final moment came weeks later, outside the same community center where my father had been humiliated. County officials arrived first, then an unmarked vehicle. Lauren stepped out slowly, eyes down, no clipboard this time, no microphone. People gathered without realizing they were doing it, drawn by the weight of what they were witnessing. She was escorted past the crowd she once controlled with a smile and a raised voice. No one cheered, but no one looked away either. I stood near the edge of the lot, my father beside me. He watched quietly as she was led toward the vehicle, hands folded in front of her, posture stiff. When the door closed, he let out a breath I didn't realize he'd been holding for weeks. The same people who had once stood by while he was handcuffed on that dock now watched power change hands for real. Not with shouting, not with spectacle, with consequences. And in that moment, something subtle but important shifted in the community. Fear gave way to clarity. Authority stopped being something assumed and became something questioned. And for the first time since this all began, the silence felt different. It felt earned. The weeks after Lauren's removal felt strangely quiet, like the air after a long storm finally settles. The chaos didn't end all at once, but it unraveled steadily, piece by piece, as truth replaced assumption. The HOA board was dissolved and reformed under county supervision, stripped of the unchecked authority that had allowed one person to run it like a personal empire. New bylaws were drafted in plain language. It felt earned. Enforcement powers were narrowed. Financial transparency became mandatory. For the first time since Silver Pines existed, decisions required actual consent instead of intimidation. Refunds followed, not just for the obvious misuses of funds, but for fines and fees that never should have been levied in the first place. Residents who once defended Lauren now stood in line at community meetings asking how something so wrong had gone unnoticed for so long. The answer was uncomfortable, but necessary. People trusted authority without verifying it, and that trust had been abused. Formal access agreements were drafted next, real ones, clear boundaries, written permissions, defined limitations, no more assumptions, no more vague language that could be twisted later. The lake remained private, but specific respectful use was allowed under conditions that protected both the land and the people who enjoyed it. Everything was documented, recorded, and reviewed by the county. There would be no gray areas left for anyone to exploit again. The day my father returned to the dock felt heavier than I expected. He hadn't said much since the incident. The humiliation lingered in small ways. A pause before answering the phone. A hesitation before leaving the house. That morning he woke up early, packed his old tackle box, and asked if I wanted to come with him. We drove down in silence, the same way we had the day I took him home after Lauren had him removed. This time the dock looked the same. Weathered boards, gentle ripples against the posts. But everything else felt different. Neighbors were already there. Some fishing, some just sitting quietly near the shore. When my father stepped out of the truck, conversations stopped. A few people looked uncertain, like they weren't sure what to say. Then someone waved. Another nodded. A woman he'd known for years walked over and apologized, her voice thick with regret. Others followed, not making excuses, just acknowledging what they should have spoken up about sooner. My father didn't grandstand. He didn't lecture. He simply smiled, stepped onto the dock, and cast his line into the water like he had done thousands of times before. The lake accepted him back without hesitation. That was the moment I knew this wasn't just about winning a fight. It was about repairing something that had been damaged much deeper than property lines. I spent the next few months working with attorneys and conservation specialists to make sure the lake could never be used as leverage again. We established a land trust, one designed to protect the water system permanently while honoring its history and purpose. The trust outlined strict conditions for access, conservation standards, and long-term stewardship. It ensured that no HOA, no developer, and no future board could quietly rewrite the rules behind closed doors. The lake was no longer vulnerable to ambition disguised as progress. The water flowed the same as it always had, but now it did so under protection that matched my grandfather's original intent. Controlled, documented, ethical. Families still swam, kids still fished, but everyone understood where the water came from and why respect mattered. My father's health improved once the stress lifted. His sleep returned. His hands steadied. The dock became a place of peace again instead of conflict. Sometimes we sat there together at sunrise, not talking much, just listening to the water move through the channels his father had built. Silver Pines didn't fall apart without Lauren. It changed. Slowly. Carefully. It became a neighborhood instead of a machine. People stopped treating rules like weapons and started treating them like agreements. Meetings became quieter. Voices softened. The fear that once kept everyone compliant faded into something more durable. Understanding. The lake remains what it always was. Not a bargaining chip. Not an amenity to be seized. But a responsibility passed down, protected not by threats or authority, but by clarity and restraint. The water flows, legally, ethically, and forever ours. I didn't win this by shouting the loudest or embarrassing anyone in public. I didn't win by trying to outbully a bully. What changed everything was slowing down, stepping back, and understanding how the system actually worked. Then using that knowledge with restraint instead of anger. HOAs like the one Lauren ran don't survive on strength. They survive on silence, confusion, and fear. They count on people being too tired, too intimidated, or too polite to question authority. The moment you document everything, verify the facts, and refuse to back down quietly, that authority starts to crack. Not with a bang, but with the slow realization that it was never as solid as it pretended to be. These days, my father is back where he belongs. Most mornings, you'll find him on that same dock with a fishing pole in his hands, greeting neighbors who now understand what really happened. Kids still swim in the lake, families still gather along the shore. The water hasn't changed, only the way it's respected. The lake was never a commodity. It was never a bargaining chip. It was a responsibility passed down through generations, protected not by threats or force, but by clarity, documentation, and integrity. If there's one thing this experience taught me, it's this. Real power doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need a microphone or a clipboard. Real power is structural, quiet, patient, and when used responsibly, it outlasts every bully who tries to steal it. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Gone Wild. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?